My name's Connor. I'm 24, just finished school, and was excited to start fresh in a new city. I had found an apartment on Craigslist, a 2-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood for cheap rent. My roommate was this guy named Ethan, around my age, maybe a little older. He seemed normal enough during our first meeting, though he worked late shifts at a bar downtown, so we didn't cross paths much. I didn't think much of it. The rent was low, and it seemed like the perfect setup. At first, things were fine for a few months. We had that typical roommate dynamic, civil but not close. Ethan mostly kept to himself. He was quiet, didn't bring people over, and was hardly ever around during the day. He'd leave for work around 4 p.m. and come back sometime in the middle of the night. Sometimes I'd hear the door creak open around 3 a.m., but I rarely saw him. Then one night, Ethan didn't come home. I didn't think anything of it at first. Maybe he had a late shift or crashed at a friend's place. A day passed, then 2, then 3. No word from Ethan. I shot him a few texts. No reply. I asked around at the bar he worked at, but they hadn't seen him either. That's when I started getting a little concerned. By the second week, I was more than worried. I was freaked out. Something wasn't right. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe he skipped town, got into some trouble, or something worse. I didn't know what to do, so I called the cops to report him missing. They asked me all the standard questions, but there wasn't much to go on. It wasn't like we were close, so I didn't have much information about his personal life. That's when I decided to look through his room. I didn't want to invade his privacy, but I had to know if there was anything at all, that could explain where he went. The first thing I noticed was how neat everything was. His bed was made, clothes folded in his drawers, nothing out of place. It was almost too neat. Then I saw the box. It was a small wooden box tucked away in the back of his closet. I don't know what made me open it, but when I did, my blood ran cold. Inside were photos of women, bound and gagged, their faces twisted in fear. Some looked like they were taken inside dark rooms, others in what seemed like abandoned places. There were at least a dozen photos, and none of them looked like they'd been taken for fun. I felt sick to my stomach. Beneath the photos were notebooks, journals filled with scribbled, obsessive entries. They detailed kidnappings in excruciating detail. Names, dates, locations. Ethan had been following these women, documenting everything. My hands started to shake. How had I lived with this guy for months and not known? I couldn't read anymore. I shut the box and backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I dialed the police again, and this time, I told them what I'd found. They came over within the hour, and the apartment was soon crawling with detectives. The investigation was intense. They questioned me for hours, going over everything I knew about Ethan, which in hindsight wasn't much. I gave them the box, and they took his journals as evidence. A few days later, they told me they had found Ethan. Dead. They found his body in an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He had been tied up and beaten to death. The police suspected it was some kind of retaliation, maybe from people involved in his crimes or someone else he had crossed. Whatever it was, it seemed like Ethan had finally gotten what was coming to him. But that didn't make it any easier for me to process. I couldn't believe that for months I had lived with a guy who had been doing such horrific things right under my nose. I kept going over every interaction we'd had, every conversation, every glance, and wondering if there had been signs I'd missed. I felt sick, disgusted, and terrified all at once. I couldn't stay in that apartment after that. I packed my things and left as soon as I could. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow made me jump. The thought of being in that space where Ethan had plotted God knows what made my skin crawl. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. I've moved to a different city, but I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights. half expecting to find Ethan standing over me or to see his ghost lurking in the corners of my new place. The police closed the case, but for me, it will never really be over. I lived with a monster, and I never saw it coming. My name's Nathan, 25 years old. After finishing college, I got a job in the city and needed a place to stay. Finding an apartment was tough, but I managed to get lucky with a Craigslist ad. It was a 2-bedroom place, decent enough, and the rent was cheap for the area. My new roommate, Jared, seemed normal during our first few interactions. He was around my age, kept to himself mostly, but we got along okay. We weren't friends, but we were civil. We'd chat here and there, watch TV together sometimes, and that was it. But something about Jared always seemed a bit off. For one, he was secretive, like really secretive. His room was always locked, and he kept his closet locked too, which struck me as weird. I tried not to pry. I mean, everyone has their quirks, right? I figured he was just really private, but that locked closet was strange. Jared would even double-check it sometimes when he left the apartment, making sure it was secure before heading out. I thought it was overkill, but I didn't dwell on it. Until one night. It was late, around midnight, and Jared was out. He worked weird hours at a warehouse, often coming home after midnight, and that night was no different. I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I started hearing these noises. At first, I thought it was coming from the apartment next door, but as I muted the TV, I realized the sound was coming from Jared's room. It was soft, almost like someone was tapping on something. Then I heard it, this low, muffled voice. It sent a chill down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, but as I listened closer, it sounded like someone was crying. My heart started pounding. I stood up, tiptoeing toward Jared's room. My mind was racing with thoughts I didn't want to entertain, but I couldn't help it. I reached Jared's door and pressed my ear against it. There it was again, a faint thud, followed by what sounded like a whimper. My palms were sweaty. I tried to reason with myself, thinking maybe he had some weird recording playing in there. But why would someone do that? And why was it locked all the time? I don't know what got into me, but I decided I had to find out what was going on. I looked around the apartment, searching for something to break the lock. I found a small crowbar in the kitchen drawer. My hands were shaking as I went back to Jared's room. Taking a deep breath, I jammed the crowbar into the door frame and pushed hard. It took a few tries, but eventually, the lock gave way and the door swung open. The closet door was in front of me, the lock on it staring me down like some ominous warning. My heart raced as I went for it next. I pried the closet open, and what I saw inside will never leave my mind. A woman, barely conscious, her eyes swollen and red, was tied up inside the closet. Her wrists were bound with rope, and there was tape over her mouth. Her clothes were torn, and she looked like she hadn't eaten in days. I froze, feeling like I was in some kind of nightmare. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. I rushed to her, my hands trembling as I pulled the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, tears streaming down her face. I untied her wrists and helped her out of the closet. She could barely stand, so I held her up. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice shaky. Just as I turned to leave, I heard the front door open. Jared was home. Panic surged through me. I quickly guided the woman into my room and locked the door behind us. My heart was pounding in my chest as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Jared must have heard me because he started banging on the door, screaming my name. The woman was shaking uncontrollably, sobbing quietly in the corner as Jared's pounding grew louder and louder. My hands were slick with sweat, fumbling with my phone as I begged the operator to send help. The minutes felt like hours as Jared continued to pound on the door. "Nathan, open the door. Let's talk." His voice was cold, nothing like the friendly guy I'd gotten to know. This wasn't the Jared I knew. This was something darker, more twisted. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. Jared must have heard them too, because the pounding stopped abruptly. Everything went silent. After what felt like forever, I heard the front door slam shut. He was gone. When the police arrived, they found Jared's car a few blocks away. They arrested him later that night. The woman was taken to the hospital, and I had to give my statement to the cops over and over again. Jared had been keeping her, and apparently other women, captive for months. He was some kind of twisted predator, kidnapping women and locking them away in that damn closet. I moved out the next day. I couldn't stay there, not after what had happened. I still have nightmares about it, about Jared, about that woman, about what could have happened if I hadn't broken into that closet. I'll never understand how I lived with someone like him without knowing. The police said I was lucky to be alive. But honestly, I don't feel lucky. I feel haunted. Every day, I still hear those soft thuds. My name's Dylan. I'm 28, working a regular 9-to-5 job at an insurance company. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills. I've been living in this 2-bedroom apartment for about 2 years now. My roommate, Travis, moved in a little over a year ago. He seemed like the ideal guy to share a space with, quiet, respectful, kept to himself. I never thought twice about him. We never really hung out, but I was fine with that. We both did our own thing. I spent my evenings unwinding with Netflix, while Travis usually stayed in his room or went out late at night, saying he was meeting up with old friends. He never seemed shady or weird. In fact, he was polite to a fault, always cleaned up after himself. Never made noise late at night, and even paid his rent early. I couldn't have asked for a better roommate. That changed one night when I was watching TV. My phone rang, and it was an unknown number. I hesitated to answer, but for some reason I did. "This is Officer Malone with the local police department. Is this Dylan?" The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something you need to know. Your roommate, Travis, was arrested earlier tonight." I felt my stomach drop. "What? What for?" The officer paused for a second, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "He's been taken in for murder. We're still gathering evidence, but we'll need you to stay put. We'll be sending officers to your location to search the apartment." I hung up, my head spinning. Murder? Travis? It didn't make sense. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I sat there in shock for what felt like hours, my mind racing through everything I knew about him. Who was he meeting on those late-night outings? What had I missed? When I finally snapped out of it, I found myself standing outside his bedroom door. I had never been in there before, and he always kept it locked when he wasn't home. But now, I couldn't resist. I needed to know who I had been living with all this time. I took a paperclip, and after a few minutes of fumbling with the lock, finally got the door open. The room smelled stale, like it hadn't been aired out in months. I flicked on the light and saw his bed neatly made, everything in place. But my eyes went straight to the desk in the corner. On it were stacks of old newspaper clippings. I shuffled through them, my hands shaking. Each one detailed unsolved murders that had occurred in the area over the past few years. There were photos of the victims, young women, all killed in brutal, horrifying ways. And under each photo, someone had scribbled notes. The handwriting was familiar. It was Travis's handwriting. I felt sick. My vision blurred as I pieced together the truth. Travis wasn't who he said he was. He had been living under a fake name, hiding in plain sight. He was the one responsible for those murders. And all this time, he had been using our apartment as a hideout, right under my nose. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to close in around me. How had I not seen it? The signs were there, but I had ignored them. I had let a killer live just a few feet away from me for over a year. Before I could process it any further, there was a knock at the door. The police had arrived. I let them in, numb and terrified. As they searched the apartment, I just sat on the couch, staring at the floor, trying to come to terms with the horrifying reality. I've moved out since then, but I can't shake the feeling of dread. The image of Travis's notes and those clippings haunt me every night. The worst part, I'll never forget that for over a year, I lived side by side with a murderer, and I never even knew.